Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's podcast. I first want to apologize for a cold that I'm recovering from, and so if my voice sounds a little bit different, that's why. Recovering from something I picked up over the holidays. And so with that, I do want to mention also that today's topic is going to be forest carbon trends to be on the lookout for in 2023. I want to mention too that this podcast will also be in a written form. And I do want to mention in written form, I have what I call Trends in Forest Analytics. And that's a weekly LinkedIn newsletter that I send out to subscribers. And so if you're on LinkedIn, even if you're not on LinkedIn, you can still watch and still read what's in that newsletter. And so I encourage you, if you want to find it, you can type Trends in Forest Analytics or my name, Matt Russell, in the LinkedIn, and you should be able to find it. And so this podcast will appear there in written form as well. So we can dive right into it. I think when we look back, certainly this is a great time to reflect as a new year is upon us. When we look back to forest carbon programs from last year, we saw a lot of innovations and a lot of developments, especially in the voluntary carbon markets. Within the voluntary carbon markets, they eclipsed $2 billion in annual value last year. And so that's just a reflection of the incredible amount of interest in forest carbon by companies, by organizations that are interested in setting net zero goals or climate mitigation goals that are a part of their companies' initiatives. Also, when we look at different methodologies, one of the new things that was approved by Verra, one of the governing bodies of the standards and certifications of forest carbon programs, was the methodology that uses dynamic baselines. And so this is something that is kind of in contrast to kind of a set baseline that may be at a regional level or some broader baseline, with the dynamic baseline being, well, every forest carbon project has a different baseline that uses and compares the carbon in that forest to carbon in surrounding forests that are similar in structure and composition. And then I think in November 22, another thing that came to mind in November 2022 was a new climate acquiring about 1.7 million acres from the Forestland Group to add forests to their carbon development portfolio. And so I think an incredible interest in large landowners looking to do carbon development projects on their lands. So those are a few things kind of as we think of in 2022 that I think have informed and really set the tone for what we might expect in 2023. And so with that, I'll jump into, I have 5 things. I probably could have made the list longer, but I'll mention 5 things to be on the lookout for related to forest carbon programs and markets in 2023. And so the first one is to be on the lookout for integrating remote sensing in forest carbon programs. And so we know it's been traditionally the ground-based inventories have been the standard for understanding and measuring forest carbon. Thinking about field crews going out into the woods, boots on the ground, wrapping diameter tapes around trees, measuring tree heights, counting dead trees, coarse-woody debris, things like that. That's been the tradition. That's been kind of the long-held position of a lot of forest inventories and forest carbon programs. But this is beginning to change as companies are increasingly seeing the value of implementing remote sensing technologies to better understand carbon. And many forest carbon programs and verifiers are being proactive about this. There's one climate tech company called Pachama that's actually right now undergoing a pilot project with Verra to better understand how digital tools can be used in the context of forest carbon accounting and methodologies. And so this, I think, is a really interesting program. And there's a working group that's been established, as I understand it, that's really looking at understanding how do we do what's called digital measurement, reporting, and verification within a forest carbon program. And so I think because artificial intelligence and machine learning and using technologies like LiDAR is so widespread in the rest of our world, why shouldn't it be and why shouldn't it have a place in forest carbon programs as well? And so I think in 2023 we're going to be seeing a lot more different algorithms, different digital tools come that are becoming increasingly more accurate in forecasting how much carbon is on the landscape in certain project areas. Because companies and organizations are relying much more on this remotely sensed data, I think that forest carbon programs and the methodologies will need to broaden themselves to really incorporate remote sensing and things like LiDAR and satellite-based imagery to better understand forest carbon. I think it will only benefit many of the forest carbon programs and will really allow lots of landowners to participate in forest carbon programs. The second thing to be on the lookout for is the price of carbon and how might that change and how might that influence landowner decisions to enroll in carbon markets. And when I think about the price of carbon here, I really look to the regulatory carbon markets. And so these are the ones that are really set through organizations like the California Air Resources Board. And so they are really the only regulatory body that has a regulatory or a compliance-driven forest carbon market. If we look back to what the prices of carbon were sold through their auctions within 2022, the all-time high was actually in May at their May auction, where carbon on a per-ton basis sold for $30.85. But by the end of the year, at least in their last auction in November, it then decreased to $26.80. And so that's interesting to see, kind of that $4 difference just within a year. And I think this is incredibly important because that price of carbon can ultimately affect the decision for a landowner to enroll in a carbon program or not. And certainly when we think about weighing the benefits of being enrolled in a carbon program versus other benefits such as timber harvesting, based on the structure and the composition of a forest land, understanding that price of carbon will be needed to understand whether or not landowners decide to enroll in a carbon program. And I think this is particularly true for the small private woodland owners that are really interested in maybe carbon and understanding if they can have a place in the climate discussions and climate strategies, but also understanding that timber harvesting could potentially outweigh prices of carbon that they might receive if they're enrolled in the program. And so I think in 2023, particularly when it seems like most of the major economists are pointing to a high probability of a recession in our economy, what's that price of carbon going to be? Is that going to play a role in enrolling in a carbon market versus timber harvesting and things like that? So I think continuing to have your eyes and ears on the price of carbon will be a big thing in 2023. The third thing is verification of new methodologies. And so there's been a lot of movement, as I mentioned earlier, a new method looking at dynamic baselines that was recently approved by Verra. But with such a tremendous growth that the voluntary carbon markets have seen since in the last several years, there are lots of new methodologies being developed and improved upon that really look at forest carbon. And so there are going to be companies or verification bodies like Verra and like Climate Action Reserve that are going to continue to look at the submissions of these new methodologies and see whether they fit within their governing bodies. And so I think, again, with this, a lot of these new methods, I think, are going to be involved with the digital measurement and reporting and verification. And so thinking about things like satellite imagery, like other technologies that are going to assist in informing what forest carbon baselines are, I think that's going to be a really big movement in terms of the methodologies that will seek approval in many of these different programs. And I think we're also poised to kind of see the concept of ton-year accounting as a methodology for forest carbon continue to be in the discussions. And so I think especially as it relates to smaller term projects, over the course of 1 year or a few years, this idea of ton-year accounting is not going away. And there are lots of at least one group that is NCX that is poised and is well positioned to continue to press on and to bring the concepts of 10-year accounting to a large number of landowners. My fourth thing to be on the lookout for in 2023 is carbon credits in urban and community forests. And so I think we often talk about carbon credits think about the rural forests, or what we think about it as traditional forests. But urban and community forests are really well positioned to play a big role in the carbon offset discussion in 2023. Why? Well, I think in part it's because of the large amount of funding that urban forests are going to be receiving from the Inflation Reduction Act. And so that act had billions of dollars set aside for urban and community forests as a result of funding that's available through that Inflation Reduction Act. And I think a lot of that funding is going to be used for tree planting efforts. And as organizations and municipalities and nonprofit companies and organizations are going to be looking at tree planting efforts in this coming year, they're going to be putting that Inflation Reduction Act funding to use. And so as people are planting those trees, it's ripe opportunity for a lot of programs that are available now that will pay for basically the growth in those urban trees in a forest carbon program. And so as companies are looking to invest locally in their own backyards and they're looking for high quality carbon credits, they're going to be looking to places like urban and community forests. And so I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about urban and community forests as it relates to carbon, and they'll likely see a lot of growth here in the next year. And then my fifth and final thing to mention about kind of where forest carbon is headed into the next year is credits for biodiversity. And so we often think about monetizing and natural capital. We've made a lot of headwinds in the last several years on forest carbon with a lot of new programs, a lot of new methodologies. But I think there's going to be a lot more interest in the biodiversity in our forests and not just the amount of carbon that's in our forests. And so this is coming off the heels of last month, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, that ended with an agreement to place 30% of the world's of the planet, 30% of the planet, and 30% of the degraded ecosystems in the planet under protection by 2030. And so this is one of those really big goals that these multi-nation governing bodies kind of set forth. It's a lofty goal, but I think the agreement sets the tone for understanding biodiversity initiatives and market-based practices in forestry and other conservation initiatives. And so I think that as we are able to understand the biodiversity, as we're able to better understand how much biodiversity is and how do we quantify it, I think they're going to be playing a larger role in our nature-based climate solutions here as we go into the next year. And I will say that, if you really thought that quantifying forest carbon was complex, I think there's going to be a lot more innovation and a lot more creativity in terms of how organizations are quantifying biodiversity that are going to be trying to capitalize on the natural capital within our forests and even other ecosystems as well, whether from wetlands or even oceans and things like that. So I think there's going to be a lot more interest in 2023 in credits for biodiversity and not just forest carbon. And so that does it. Thanks for listening, everyone. Again, I encourage you to check out my LinkedIn newsletter, Trends in Forest Analytics, if you want to have if you want to see this in written form, and I will publish that here this week. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.